Jamal's heart raced as Richard slid a thick envelope across the table. $10,000 in cash, more than he had ever seen in his entire life. His mother, Sophia, stood frozen, her eyes brimming with tears. The weight of the years of struggle, the sleepless nights, the constant fear, it all came crashing down. "You don't have to worry anymore," Richard said, his voice steady. For the first time, Jamal and his mother saw a future, not filled with fear, but with hope. This moment would change their lives forever. But before we dive deeper into the story, let me know where you are watching this from in the comments below. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss out on future stories. Jamal limped down the cracked sidewalk, his blistered feet barely able to carry him anymore. The midday heat scorched the pavement, but the pain in his soles was far worse than anything the sun could throw at him. He could feel the sweat running down his neck, mixing with the dirt and grime that had settled into his skin. But he didn't care. He wasn't thinking about anything other than finding food. Anything to fill the gnawing emptiness in his stomach. His mother, Sophia, had long since left for another one of her long shifts, cleaning houses for people who probably didn't even know she had a son. She worked herself to the bone, day after day, just to make sure they stayed afloat in this godforsaken place. But it was never enough. It never would be. Jamal had learned the hard way that when you lived in a place like this, you had to fight for every scrap you got, and that's exactly what he was doing today. Behind the mall, he had found a few discarded cans, barely worth anything but enough to buy a half-stale sandwich, maybe even a bottle of water. The cans were worth a few bucks if you were lucky, but he wasn't counting on luck, not anymore. His stomach growled, a harsh reminder of just how desperate he was. He bent down to pick up the cans, his fingers trembling slightly as he stuffed them into the plastic bag he'd salvaged from the trash. As he straightened up, ready to make his way to the pawn shop, a voice cut through the heat of the day. "Hey, little man." Jamal froze. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The voice was low, thick with authority, and the kind of menace that made you want to shrink into the shadows. He slowly turned his head, meeting the eyes of Marcus, one of the local gang members who ruled this part of town like a king. Marcus was tall, broad-shouldered, his face scarred from years of violence. His smile was the kind that made your skin crawl, and his hands were always ready to reach into your pockets. Jamal swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't stupid. He knew how things worked around here, and he knew that a kid like him didn't survive in this world without paying his dues. Marcus stepped closer, his boots echoing against the pavement, each step heavier than the last. "You know the rules, little man," he said, his voice like gravel. 20% of whatever you make goes to us for protection." Jamal's stomach twisted. He wanted to say something, to fight back, but the words got stuck in his throat. What could he say? He barely had enough to get by as it was. But Marcus wasn't the kind of guy who took no for an answer. "I haven't found anything yet," Jamal mumbled, hoping his voice didn't crack. Marcus raised an eyebrow, his grin widening. "Don't lie to me. I saw you yesterday with those cans. Where's our cut?" Jamal looked down at the bag in his hands, his pulse racing. It wasn't a lot, just a few cans, barely worth more than $1 or $2. But Marcus wasn't interested in fairness. He never was. Jamal's hands clenched around the plastic, his mind racing. He didn't want trouble, didn't want to deal with this man any more than he had to. "Please, Marcus," Jamal said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need this. My mom, she's working all day. We're just trying to survive." Marcus stepped forward, closing the distance between them. His breath smelled of cigarettes and cheap whiskey. "Survival, huh?" he sneered, his eyes narrowing. "That's not how this works. You don't survive here, unless you pay the price." Jamal could feel the weight of Marcus's presence closing in on him, the threat of violence hanging in the air like a storm cloud ready to break. His chest tightened. He had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Every street, every corner was ruled by guys like Marcus. They were the ones who controlled everything. "Listen, kid," Marcus continued, his voice now a low growl. "You want to keep walking around here like nothing's wrong? Fine. But don't think for a second I'll let you get by without paying your dues. You owe me now." Jamal's heart raced as he fumbled for words. He had nothing to give. The few coins he had scraped together were meant for his mother, meant to make sure she had something when she came home. But he couldn't say that to Marcus. If he did, it'd be worse. Marcus stepped closer, reaching out with one hand to snatch the bag from Jamal's grip. "You want to keep your skin in one piece? You'll give me what's mine." Jamal wanted to scream, to fight back, but his legs felt like lead, his hands shaking. The weight of it all, the hopelessness of his life, pressed down on him, and for a moment he wondered if it would ever end. "I don't have anything," Jamal whispered, his voice small, weak. "I'm not lying, I swear." But Marcus was done listening. He grabbed the bag, yanking it from Jamal's grasp. "Now you've got two choices," Marcus sneered. "You give me the money, or you learn what happens when you don't pay up." Jamal stood there, paralyzed, his mind screaming for a way out. But there was no way out, not for him, not for kids like him. Suddenly, he felt the sharp sting of Marcus's slap across his face. It knocked him to the ground, the world spinning. For a moment, Jamal thought he might lose consciousness, but he didn't. He couldn't. The thought of his mother, of the life she worked so hard for, kept him going. He might be small, he might be hungry, but he wasn't ready to give up just yet. He pulled himself to his knees, feeling the scrape of the rough pavement on his skin. He wasn't going to let Marcus break him, not today. But the question remained, how much more could Jamal take before he broke? Jamal sat on the curb, his feet burning against the searing concrete, trying to ignore the heat that crawled up his legs. The sun above him beat down relentlessly, and the city's noise, the honking horns, shouting vendors, and the constant hum of traffic felt like a cruel reminder of how insignificant he was in a world that barely noticed him. His stomach growled, but it wasn't the hunger that gnawed at him the most. It was the feeling of hopelessness that seemed to swallow him whole. He didn't want to be here, not in this place. The cracked sidewalks, the stale air, the endless cycle of poverty. It was all too much. He had hoped for a miracle, something to break through the monotony, but so far, all he had received were punches from life. As Jamal stared down at his feet, lost in his thoughts, he heard a voice break through the noise. It's about 90°C out here and you don't have any shoes. You okay?" Jamal froze, lifting his head to meet the man who spoke. The stranger wasn't someone he recognized, but he stood out in a way that made Jamal immediately uneasy. He was dressed in a crisp suit, looking completely out of place in this run-down neighborhood. His shoes shone brightly under the harsh sunlight, and there was an air of confidence about him that made Jamal uncomfortable. "I'm fine," Jamal muttered, not wanting to engage with anyone. People didn't look at him unless it was to pass judgment, and he had learned to avoid unnecessary attention. The man didn't seem convinced. He crouched down to Jamal's level, his gaze steady but not harsh. "You're sitting on a burning sidewalk with no shoes? I'd like to know why." Jamal shrugged, unwilling to explain himself to someone who wouldn't understand. "Just passing time." The man studied him for a moment, then sat down next to him on the curb, his movements graceful, almost rehearsed. "You're not passing time, kid, you're surviving." He glanced at Jamal's feet again, frowning. "It doesn't take much to see that. What are you doing out here alone? Where's your family?" Jamal shifted uncomfortably, the words sticking to the back of his throat. "My mom works," he said finally, though it sounded hollow even to him. "She's cleaning houses. Doesn't have time for me." The stranger's face softened slightly. He looked at Jamal with a mixture of curiosity and concern, something Jamal wasn't used to seeing in the eyes of the people who passed him by every day. They all ignored him, just like everyone else in this neighborhood. "I say," the man said, still studying Jamal, "you should come with me. Let me buy you a meal. There's a diner down the street. It's not much, but it'll be a hell of a lot better than sitting out here." Jamal's brow furrowed as he met the stranger's eyes. He didn't know what to make of him. No one ever offered him anything in this part of town. People didn't do things like that unless they wanted something in return. And Jamal wasn't stupid. He had learned long ago to stay on guard, to never trust anyone, especially not people who seemed too good to be true. "Would you do that?" Jamal asked, his voice laced with skepticism. "You don't even know me." The stranger smiled faintly. Maybe I don't. But I know what it's like to go hungry, and I'm not asking for anything in return. You look like you could use a meal, and I've got a little extra to spare." Jamal eyed him carefully, trying to gauge if there was any hidden agenda behind the man's offer. But all he saw was sincerity in his eyes, and that only made him more confused. People like this didn't show up in his life. They didn't notice kids like him. "I'm fine," Jamal said again, trying to push the man's offer away. He didn't need charity, not now, not ever. The stranger leaned back slightly, not pushing any further, but not backing down either. He gave Jamal a moment of silence, letting the heat and the tension hang in the air. Then, almost as if deciding to take a different approach, he spoke again, his voice softer, more understanding. "You're a tough kid, I can see that, but no one can make it alone forever. Eventually, everyone needs someone." Jamal clenched his jaw, irritated now. "I don't need anyone," he snapped, the words escaping before he could stop them. "My mom's doing fine without anyone's help. We've made it this far." The stranger's gaze never wavered. "You're strong, but strength isn't always about doing everything by yourself. Sometimes it's about letting someone else in. You deserve more than this, you know." He paused for a moment, as if considering his next words carefully. "What if this meal was the start of something better for you?" Jamal's chest tightened at the stranger's words. Something about them felt too real, too close to home. He knew he didn't belong here, in this filthy street, barefoot and hungry. He had spent his life believing that the only way to survive was to push others away, to shut himself off from everyone and everything. His mother had taught him that. She had always told him to keep his head down and never expect anyone to help. But here was this man offering him something different, a meal, a chance at something more. Jamal shifted uncomfortably, his heart torn between suspicion and a faint, dangerous hope that had started to creep in. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost as if testing the waters. "Richard," the man replied, extending his hand toward Jamal. "And I'm not asking for anything from you, Jamal, just a chance to help." Jamal stared at Richard's hand for a long moment, his heart pounding in his chest. The warmth of the man's gesture, the sincerity in his eyes, made him hesitate. It was strange, unfamiliar. Jamal didn't know how to react to someone who wasn't trying to take something from him. He wasn't used to kindness, especially not in a place like this. Finally, he reached out, shaking Richard's hand. It wasn't a decision made lightly, but it was a decision nonetheless, a moment of vulnerability, a crack in the armor he had built around himself for so long. "I don't know about this," Jamal muttered, still unsure. Richard smiled, a genuine, easy smile that made him seem less like a stranger and more like someone who could actually understand. "That's all right. But I'll tell you this. You'll never know what's possible if you keep saying no. Why don't you give it a shot? Worst thing that happens is we have a meal and you walk away. But maybe, just maybe, It's the start of something different." Jamal didn't know what that something different was, but he felt a spark of curiosity, maybe even hope, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Without another word, Richard stood up and offered his hand once more. Jamal hesitated for a moment longer, then stood too, his legs stiff from sitting too long on the hard sidewalk. Richard led the way, and Jamal followed, his mind spinning with questions he didn't know how to ask. As they walked to the diner, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that for the first time in his life, someone saw him. Someone cared enough to offer more than just a passing glance. Maybe Richard's offer was just a meal, but to Jamal it felt like a lifeline. And in that moment, as he stepped into the air-conditioned diner with Richard by his side, Jamal couldn't help but wonder what else this man might offer and what it could mean for his future. The meal at the diner was the first time Jamal had eaten something that didn't taste like desperation. The greasy but satisfying burger filled his stomach, and the ice-cold soda was a luxury. He could almost forget where he was, almost forget the grim reality that awaited him when he walked out of this place. But as the last bite of his meal disappeared, Richard's voice brought him back to the present. "Tell me more about your situation," Richard said, leaning back in his chair, eyes fixed on Jamal with that same intensity from before. "You don't end up on the street like this unless something's gone seriously wrong." Jamal hesitated, shifting uncomfortably. He didn't like talking about his mother's struggles, didn't like to admit that they were barely hanging on by a thread. But Richard's kindness, the way he'd looked at him with no judgment, made him feel like it might be okay to share. Maybe he wasn't the only one who cared. "My mom, Sophia?" Jamal's voice wavered for a second. She's working 2 jobs, cleaning houses, doing whatever she can to make ends meet, but it's never enough. We're behind on rent, bills are stacking up. Marcus," Jamal's throat tightened at the mention of the gang member, "he's been coming around, demanding money. He says we owe him. He says it's for protection, but it's just him and his crew taking whatever they want. If we don't pay, he says things are going to get worse." Richard's expression darkened. "Marcus, huh?" His voice was low, dangerous even, as if the name alone ignited something inside him. I don't like that guy. He's nothing but a bully. And it sounds like your mom's already fighting a battle she can't win. You shouldn't have to live like this, Jamal." Jamal looked down at his hands, embarrassed. "She's all I've got left. She doesn't even know I'm out here, hustling for scraps. I don't want her to worry about me, but I don't know how long we can keep this up." Richard's eyes softened, his gaze shifting from cold calculation to something warmer, more sincere. "You don't have to keep doing this alone, Jamal. I can help." Jamal met his eyes, searching for the catch, the angle that would lead to disappointment, but he found nothing but determination in Richard's gaze. "I'll give you the money you need," Richard continued, "the protection fee you're paying to Marcus. I'll handle it. And when you're ready, I want to meet your mother. I want to help you both, however I can." Jamal blinked, stunned. For a moment he couldn't process the words. No one had ever offered him anything like this. People passed through his life all the time, but they never stuck around long enough to help. They never cared enough to follow through. This felt different. But was it too good to be true? Would you do that?" Jamal asked, his voice shaking slightly. He had to know. He had to understand why Richard would even bother with someone like him. Richard leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Because you deserve better, Jamal. You shouldn't have to fight your way through every day just to survive. I can't fix everything, but I can start by giving you a chance. You and your mom. Let me help you." Jamal looked down at his plate, his hands trembling as he realized how much he wanted to believe Richard. He wanted to believe that there was something better than this broken existence, something he could reach out for. But in the back of his mind, doubt lingered. Could he really trust this man? Was this just another lie waiting to crush him? Before he could speak, Richard's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and glanced at the screen. His expression shifted, becoming more focused, more intense. I've got to take this, Richard said, rising from the table. Wait for me here. I'll take care of everything. Jamal nodded silently, still lost in his thoughts. Richard left the diner, and Jamal sat alone at the table, staring at the last remnants of his meal. The weight of his life, his mother's struggles, the constant threats from Marcus, the fear of what tomorrow might bring, pressed down on him. But Richard had offered him something different, an out, a way out. By the time Richard returned, Jamal had managed to calm the storm of thoughts in his head. He still wasn't sure what to make of it, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't keep living like this. When Richard re-entered the diner, he had a look of purpose about him. He sat down, pulling out a thick envelope from his jacket pocket and sliding it across the table to Jamal. "This," Richard said, his voice firm, "is enough to cover what you owe Marcus. For now, but we need to meet your mom. We need to get her on board, and I need to know how far this goes." Jamal picked up the envelope, feeling the weight of it in his hands. It wasn't a lot, but it was more than he had ever seen in his life. His mind raced, and for the first time in weeks, he dared to think that maybe, just maybe, there was a way out. I'll take you to her," Jamal said, standing up. His voice was steadier now, more sure than it had been in ages. "But she's going to be skeptical. She's been through too much to trust anyone. Not after all this time." Richard gave him a knowing look. "I don't blame her, but sometimes people need to see for themselves. I'll let her see I'm here to help, and then we can figure it out from there." Jamal nodded, feeling a flicker of hope for the first time in a long while. They left the diner together, and as they walked through the streets of the neighborhood, Jamal's heart thudded with anticipation. He knew his mother would be difficult, and he knew she wouldn't trust Richard immediately. But if this man could help them, if he could really give them a chance at a better life, Jamal would have to find a way to make her see that. As they arrived at the small, run-down apartment building where Jamal and Sophia lived, the air felt heavy. The weight of everything that had come before, every day of struggle, every moment of fear, hung like a cloud over them. Jamal's palms were sweating as he opened the door and led Richard inside. Sophia was sitting on the couch, looking exhausted, her face drawn with the fatigue of too many sleepless nights. She looked up when they entered, her eyes narrowing as she took in the unfamiliar face standing next to her son. "Jamal?" she asked, her voice tired but sharp. "Who's this?" "This is Richard," Jamal said, his voice shaky as he introduced the man who had promised to help them. He wants to help, Mom. He's going to pay the rent. He's going to help us get back on our feet." Sophia's eyes flicked to Richard, then back to Jamal. She stood up slowly, her posture defensive, wary of anyone who could walk into her life with promises that sounded too good to be true. "I don't know who you are or why you're here," Sophia said, her voice cold with suspicion. "But we don't need charity." Richard stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not offering charity. I'm offering a chance. I know you're struggling, and I know what it's like to feel like you've run out of options. I'm here to help you both. No strings attached." Sophia's gaze remained hard, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Nobody helps, baby. Not anymore. You think we don't know how this world works? People come, they make promises, and then they're gone. Nothing changes." Jamal looked at his mother, his heart sinking. He knew she was right in a way. He had seen it all his life. People promising to help, but always leaving when it got hard. But something about Richard felt different. Something about this moment felt like it could be the change they needed. "I'm not leaving," Richard said, his voice unwavering. "I'm asking $800 for rent, $300 for electric. I'll pay that today, and you get 30 days to work something out. If you need more time, I'll give it, but I need you both to trust me, just for a moment." Sophia's face softened, but she didn't answer immediately. Jamal stood there, watching her, hoping that this time, for once, someone's promise would be real. Finally, Sophia spoke, her voice quieter now, almost uncertain. "I don't know what to believe anymore, Jamal." She paused, looking at Richard. "But if you really want to help, then show me." Richard nodded. "I'll show you, and together we'll get you out of this." As Sophia looked at the envelope in Richard's hand, the heavy weight of years of hardship seemed to lift, just a little. And for the first time in a long while, Jamal allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could escape the nightmare they had been living. The sun had just begun to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the run-down streets. The oppressive heat of the day had finally begun to give way to a slightly cooler evening, but the tension in the air felt heavier than ever. Jamal's heart was pounding in his chest as he stood on the edge of the street, watching Richard approach the decrepit building where Marcus and his crew were waiting. Jamal had never seen this side of Richard before. The calm, collected man who had bought him lunch and promised to help now walked with an air of authority, his posture straight and his gaze unwavering. Richard was no longer just the man who had offered help. He was someone with power, someone who wasn't afraid to make a stand. "This is it," Jamal muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible. "I've got this," Richard said without looking back, his voice firm, his steps determined. Jamal could hear the confidence in his words, but he knew that confidence came with a risk. The gang, led by Marcus, had terrorized this neighborhood for years, shaking down anyone they saw as weak. Richard didn't know what he was walking into, but Jamal could only hope he had the strength to back up his words. As they reached the abandoned warehouse where Marcus and his crew had set up their operation, Richard didn't hesitate. He walked right through the rusted metal door, stepping into the dim light of the interior where Marcus stood with his usual crew of thugs. The room was thick with the stench of sweat and stale air. The men stopped talking and turned, eyes narrowing as they sized up Richard. Marcus was sitting at a makeshift table in the corner, looking every bit the thug Jamal had known him to be. His shirt was open, showing off his tattoos, and a cigar dangled from his lips as he looked at Richard with a smirk. "Well, well," Marcus said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Look who decided to show up. You must be that rich guy who's been buying people meals, huh? You think you can just waltz into my turf like you own it?" Richard didn't flinch. He stepped forward, his expression cold and unreadable. "I'm not here for your games, Marcus. I'm here because you've crossed a line." Marcus' grin faded slightly, and the men around him shifted, sensing the change in the air. "You think you can threaten me? What, you gonna buy me off with a few dollars? This is how things work around here, buddy. I'm the one who makes the rules." Richard's voice remained calm, but the power behind it was unmistakable. "No, Marcus, you don't make the rules here. You just break them. You've been running this game too long, but now it's time to face the consequences." Marcus let out a harsh laugh, clearly not impressed. "Oh, I'm scared now," he sneered. "You're gonna call the cops on me? Try to play the big shot? You're wasting my time." Richard's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening as he took another step closer. "No, Marcus, I'm not calling the cops. But I will call someone who matters a lot more than you." He let the words hang in the air, making sure every man in the room understood the weight of what he was saying. "You leave Jamal and his mother alone, or I'll make one phone call to your boss. One. and trust me when I say this, you'll regret it." "Huh?" The tension in the room escalated in an instant. The men surrounding Marcus stiffened, their eyes flicking from Richard to Marcus. For the first time, Marcus didn't look so sure of himself. His grip on the cigar tightened, and his gaze flicked around the room as if searching for an escape. "You threatening me?" Marcus growled, standing up from his seat and tossing the cigar to the ground, where it sputtered out. "You think you're untouchable, huh? You make deals with everyone, don't you? This is business. It's just business." Richard didn't blink. His gaze never wavered as he met Marcus's defiant stare. "This is simple business," he said, his voice low and deadly. "You leave the Wilsons alone. You stop coming around and threatening them. You stop pretending you own this neighborhood. Or I make that call, and when your boss hears how you've been messing with people who matter to him, you'll wish you'd never laid eyes on this street." Marcus's face turned pale, the threat hitting him harder than he was willing to admit. He had been running his operation with impunity for years, pushing people around, knowing no one had the power to stop him. But Richard had struck a nerve. The mention of his boss, the one person Marcus couldn't afford to disappoint, had shaken him to his core. "You think you can just walk in here and intimidate me?" Marcus said, his voice now shaking with frustration. "You don't know who you're dealing with, rich boy. You're making a huge mistake." "I'm not the one making mistakes, Marcus," Richard shot back, his voice unwavering. "But you're about to make the biggest one of your life. You'll regret it if you don't listen." There was a long, unbearable silence as the two men locked eyes. The tension was palpable, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone in the room. The gang members looked uncertain now, their loyalty wavering as they watched their leader struggle to maintain control. They could see the power in Richard's stance, the calm assurance that came with being someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Finally, Marcus's shoulders sagged. He looked at the men around him, seeing their doubt, feeling their eyes on him. The bravado drained from his face, and for a moment he seemed small. Just another man trying to survive in a world that had no sympathy for weakness. With a growl, he turned on his heel and walked toward the door, his crew reluctantly following behind him. "Consider yourself lucky," Marcus spat, turning back to Richard before leaving. "This isn't over, but you'll get your way for now."
The door slammed behind them, leaving Richard and Jamal standing alone in the warehouse. The air felt thinner, less suffocating, now that Marcus and his gang were gone.
Jamal stood frozen, his heart racing as the adrenaline of the confrontation slowly began to wear off. He had seen the way Marcus backed down, heard the fear in his voice. For the first time, Jamal felt like someone had taken control, like someone had stood up for him and his mother. He looked at Richard, his expression a mix of disbelief and gratitude. Richard turned to him, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "It's done. They won't bother you anymore." Jamal swallowed hard, trying to process what had just happened. He couldn't believe it. It was all so surreal. Marcus, the man who had terrified him for so long, had walked away from a fight. Not because he had to, but because Richard had shown him that he wasn't the one holding all the power. Did you do it?" Jamal asked quietly, still trying to wrap his mind around the situation. "Why go up against someone like that? He could have hurt you." Richard's eyes softened, his gaze steady. "Because you deserve better, Jamal. Your mom deserves better, and no one should live in fear. Not like that." Jamal nodded, his throat tight. He didn't have the words to express everything he was feeling, the overwhelming sense of relief mixed with awe. He had spent so long fighting for survival on his own, thinking that no one would ever care enough to help. But Richard had proven him wrong. He had given him a glimpse of something he'd never thought possible, a chance at a life without fear. And for the first time in a long while, Jamal allowed himself to believe in that possibility. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Richard gave him a reassuring nod. "Don't thank me yet. This is just the beginning. We've got a lot of work to do." As they left the warehouse, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that things were finally changing. For the first time in his life, he had someone on his side, someone who cared enough to fight for him. And that was the first step toward something new, something better. Life changed faster than Jamal could fully grasp. Just a week after Richard's confrontation with Marcus, the two of them stood together in a brand new apartment, a space that smelled of fresh paint and new beginnings. For the first time, Jamal felt a real sense of security. His feet, no longer blistered from the unforgiving concrete, now rested on soft carpet. The space was small, modest even, but it was theirs. There were no threats lingering at the door, no gang members watching every move they made. The air felt different here, lighter, as if it wasn't weighed down by years of constant fear. Sophia, still in disbelief over the drastic change, stood near the kitchen, her hand gripping the counter as she watched the living room. She couldn't bring herself to say it yet, but she knew what this meant. She was starting to believe it. There was a future for them, a future she hadn't been able to picture for so long. "I don't know how to thank you, Mr. Martinez," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. Her eyes welled with unshed tears as she glanced at Richard, standing near the window, looking out at the quiet street below. Richard didn't turn to face her immediately. He was still absorbing the weight of it all, the quiet, the safety. He understood how big this was. Not just the apartment, not just the money. It was the beginning of something real. He had seen the difference in Jamal's eyes the first time they met. A boy already fighting battles no child should have to face. He had seen it in Sophia too. The exhaustion, the worry, the skepticism that had settled deep in her bones. That kind of survival mode didn't disappear overnight. He turned to her then, his face calm but firm, and said, "Don't thank me yet. This is just the beginning." Sophia's lips quivered slightly, but she nodded, understanding. It wasn't just about the apartment. It was about everything that came after, the steps they would take from here on out. "I don't know what we would have done without you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Jamal, who had been silently taking it all in, felt the same way. This was the first time he had been able to stand in a place that wasn't tainted by fear. This apartment wasn't just a new home. It was a chance for something better. For the first time, Jamal allowed himself to imagine a future without the chains of poverty, without the shadows of gang threats hanging over him and his mother. He had never thought beyond surviving the next day, but now he could see the possibility of something more, something real. "Mom?" he said, his voice steady, the weight of everything he had been holding inside now giving way to hope. "This is it. We're finally getting a chance. A real one." Sophia smiled at him, her heart swelling with the emotion she had kept buried for so long. She reached out and pulled him close. "I know, baby. I know." The next few weeks were a blur of changes. Sophia found a job as an office manager at a small firm downtown. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid well enough for them to breathe, to not worry about where the next meal would come from. The work wasn't easy, but it gave her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She was respected, not just as an employee, but as someone who had fought for everything she had. Someone who deserved to be where she was. Jamal, too, had begun a new chapter. Richard had enrolled him in the local school, and although Jamal was nervous about fitting in, about being the new kid who had spent more time on the streets than in the classroom, the teachers welcomed him. They didn't see a delinquent or a troubled kid. They saw potential, and for the first time, Jamal believed in it too. He spent late nights in his room studying, determined to prove to himself that he wasn't the person everyone had expected him to be. He wasn't a victim. He wasn't a statistic. He could be more. He would be more. Weeks turned into months, and the transformation in Jamal and Sophia was undeniable. The constant anxiety that had once clung to them like a second skin began to fade. They could walk the streets without feeling like they had to watch their backs. They could talk to neighbors without the fear of being judged or ignored. And Richard? He was still a presence in their lives, but not the way he once was. The strange man who had appeared like a savior now seemed more like a friend, someone who had seen the broken pieces and had given them the tools to rebuild. He didn't hover or offer empty promises. He simply checked in, offering encouragement when needed, never expecting anything in return. He was there, but he didn't need to be. One day, as Jamal sat at the small dining table in their new apartment, his textbooks spread out in front of him, he glanced up to find Sophia watching him with a soft smile. "You've come a long way, Jamal," she said, her voice warm with pride. Jamal smiled back, a genuine smile. "So have you." She looked down, the weight of the past few months settling over her for a moment. "I'm not sure how I got here, but I know I couldn't have done it without you." Jamal reached across the table, squeezing her hand. "We did it together. You've always been strong, Mom. You just needed someone to show you that it's okay to let people in. You've been carrying us both for so long." Sophia's eyes filled with tears, but this time, they weren't tears of despair. They were tears of gratitude, of relief. "You're right. It's just hard to trust again, but maybe it's time." Jamal nodded, his heart lighter than it had been in years. He had spent so much of his life fighting to survive, but now he could see the beginning of a real future. A future that was possible, even if it hadn't seemed so before. The doorbell rang then, and they both looked up, startled. Sophia stood and walked to the door, opening it to reveal Richard standing in the hallway. He looked the same as always, neat, collected, with a sense of calm that made him seem like he was always in control. "Hey, Richard," Jamal said, standing up to greet him. "What's up?" Richard smiled, stepping inside. "Just thought I'd check in. How's everything going?" Sophia stepped into the living room, smiling at him. "Things are going great, thanks to you. I don't know what we'd have done if you hadn't shown up that day." Richard nodded, his smile easy. "You don't have to thank me. You two did all the hard work. I'm just here to make sure you don't have to do it alone." Sophia gave a soft laugh, shaking her head. "Well, we're sure glad you did." For a moment, they all stood there, the quiet hum of the apartment filling the space around them. The sense of peace that had eluded them for so long was finally settling in. For the first time, Jamal could say he truly felt at home. Not because of the apartment, not because of the things they had, but because they had each other. They were a family again, a family with a future. Richard looked at the two of them, his eyes filled with a quiet pride. "This is just the beginning, but I'm glad to see you two finally getting what you deserve." Sophia smiled, her eyes bright with tears. "And we'll make sure we don't forget it?" Jamal looked around the apartment, feeling the weight of what had happened, of what was still happening. They were no longer trapped in the cycle of poverty and fear. They were free. And for the first time in his life, Jamal allowed himself to believe that the future wasn't something to be afraid of. It was something to look forward to. The courtroom was silent as Jamal took the stand. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, but he didn't falter. He had been afraid of speaking out for so long, afraid of the consequences, afraid of the people who might come after him. But now, sitting in front of a judge, with his mother sitting behind him, he realized this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about breaking free from fear and showing that even someone like him could make a difference. Marcus and his crew sat across the room, their once confident demeanor now replaced with nervous glances. They had been used to intimidating people, used to hiding behind their power, but now they were facing justice. Marcus, the man who had controlled their lives for so long, was no longer in charge, and Jamal was here to make sure he never hurt anyone again. When it was his turn, Jamal looked at Marcus, his eyes unwavering. For a brief moment, he saw the same man who had once threatened him. But now there was something else in Marcus's eyes. Regret. It was fleeting, but Jamal noticed it. He didn't let that stop him. He told the truth, the whole truth, without hesitation. They've been stealing from us, they've been hurting people, and they made my mom and me live in fear. Jamal's voice cracked, but he didn't back down. No one should have to live like that. No one should ever be scared to walk outside because someone might come after you. The room was quiet, the impact of his words settling in. Jamal's testimony, his courage, was what sealed the fate of the gang. Marcus and his crew were arrested and sent away, and as Jamal walked out of the courtroom with his mother, he realized that he had done something far bigger than just surviving. He had taken control of his own story. The next few months were a whirlwind of changes. Richard, who had never backed down, continued to guide Jamal through the maze of his new life. He helped Jamal navigate school, ensuring he received the education he had been denied for so long. Jamal found himself thriving, not just in the classroom, but in life. No longer was he just surviving, he was moving forward, chasing dreams he hadn't even known he could have. Sophia too was thriving. Her job as an office manager allowed her to support them with dignity. She had found a strength she didn't know she had. All because Richard had offered them a lifeline when no one else had. Jamal's life was now a far cry from the streets he had once roamed, barefoot and hungry. Every morning, he woke up with a sense of purpose, something he had never experienced before. But the most important lesson he had learned was that none of it would have been possible without one thing: kindness. Richard's kindness had been the turning point. It had been the spark that had lit a fire in Jamal to push through the pain, to push past the fear, and to rise above it all. One day as they sat together in the new apartment, Richard looked at Jamal, a proud smile on his face. "You've come a long way." Jamal nodded, his eyes thoughtful. "I think everyone deserves a chance to change like you gave us." Richard's smile grew wider. "Exactly. That's what it's all about, Jamal. Helping each other, giving people the chance to be better." Jamal sat back, the weight of his words sinking in. He had been given a chance to change, to grow, to become something more than he had ever dreamed of. And now, it was his turn to pay it forward. He realized that the kindness Richard had shown him wasn't just a gift for today, it was something he could pass on. He could be the person who made a difference for someone else. He thought back to the days when he had nothing but fear and uncertainty, when survival was the only thing on his mind. He had been that kid, sitting on the sidewalk with no hope, no future. But now, standing tall and looking at the life he had built, Jamal understood that one act of kindness could change everything. The world hadn't changed overnight, and Marcus's actions weren't erased from Jamal's mind. But Jamal had taken the power back. He had chosen to live with purpose, to be the person who helped others when they needed it most. He was no longer a bystander in his own life. He was a part of something bigger, something better. And as he walked down the street that day, his steps were sure. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was living.